Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome back to Generally Speaking with Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast. Michael, welcome back.
Hi, Jason. Good to see you.
As always, now we have a fantastic conversation. Today, we're going to be looking at the life and times of one Mr. Henry Knox. Now, we've been coupling people together up to this point, but we're a little bit late in the game, and we weren't sure where to put Henry Knox, so we gave him his own day.
Yeah, Henry Knox never was appointed separately from everybody else, so I guess it's appropriate that he's in a class by himself as far as the generals go.
Right. And we will get to there, but he's the first person after the Battle of Yorktown who becomes a major general, which is a little surprisingly late in the game for someone whose stature is so renowned, even outside of American history circles. But again, we'll get there. Where do we start with Henry Knox? I assume it begins in Boston.
Yeah, he was born in Boston, and he's one of the younger generals too, which is probably part of the reason that it took him a long time to get promoted. He was only in his mid-20s when the war began. He was born in 1750 in Boston, the son of uh, an immigrant from Northern Ireland. His father came from a Scottish family, a Scotch-Irish family. The Scots, of course, moved into Northern Ireland to bolster the Protestant population there at one point, and then kind of moved on from Ireland to America in large numbers. So the Knox family was part of that migration.
Interesting. So he grows up with a relatively modest background for most of the founders we talk about on this channel.
Yeah, he starts off, his family is reasonably well off. His father's a merchant and a shipbuilder, but he falls on hard times in the 1750s when Henry is still a child. Um, some people blame it on the Currency Act that was passed in by London in 1750 that caused some financial problems in New England in the later in the 1750s. For whatever reason, though, William Knox, the father, got heavily into debt, ended up having to sell most of the family possessions, ended up selling the family home and moving them into a smaller one, and eventually had to flee to St. Eustatius, which is an island in the Caribbean in the West Indies, where it's not clear exactly why he left, whether he was just looking for work or whether he was actually trying to avoid debtor's prison because he was in a lot of debt. But in any event, he went down to the Caribbean and a couple years later died. So, um, yeah, by the time Knox was 9 years old, he was head of the family. Um, he was actually the seventh of 10 boys um, in the Knox family, but two of his older brothers had already died, and two others of his older brothers um, had gone to sea and were working as merchant seamen already by this time, and they were, still in their young teens as well. But so Henry is 9 years old and has a younger brother and a mother to take care of. And so he drops out of Boston Latin School, which was the best school in Boston at the time. That's where the finest families went. He had to drop out and get a job working in a bookstore in Boston.
And that's the career he pursues. He makes his name later in life. Eventually, after his apprenticeship, he finds his own store.
Right. He works as a clerk. The owner of the bookstore that took him in kind of did it almost as a charity case. He felt bad for the family and kind of served as a bit of a stepfather figure for Henry while he was growing up. They had a very good relationship. But yeah, when Henry turned 21, he opened up his own bookstore in Boston and embarked on the life of a bookstore owner, which I guess he thought was going to be his whole life. Um,
You would assume.
but yeah, he was kind of interesting. He was kind of almost living in two worlds growing up because the bookstore brought in customers, from the best families in Boston, and um, so he kind of hobnobbed with some of the elites within the city, but at the same time, he was kind of a poor, struggling, almost a street rat. He had joined a gang, the South Side Gang, which regularly got into rumbles with the North Side Gang, and he actually developed a reputation as a very good fist fighter. So yeah, he was not afraid to mix it up with the the working class folk in the neighborhood, while at the same time hobnobbing with the elites when he was running the bookstore.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So Rough and Tumble Knox over here, he works at his bookstore. Now, I don't want to skip any important steps, so don't let me, as usual. I'm always eager to get to the events at hand. But leading up to the revolution, are there any more important happenings in Knox's life?
Well, he does kind of take an active role in the patriot cause. He's, as I said, he's not a legislator or anything like that. You got to remember, in the 1760s, he's still in his teens. So he's kind of just a kid, and he doesn't own his own bookstore until 1771. So this whole time he's working for somebody else, trying to develop himself. But he joins the Sons of Liberty. He's active in the protest effort, all that sort of thing. And of course, a big event happens in March in 1770 in Boston, the Boston Massacre. And Henry actually plays a pretty significant role in that. He is on his way home that evening and comes across a mob that is harassing a soldier at the customs house. And he actually tries to calm the situation and is trying to calm the mob down and trying to convince the soldiers not to fire on the mob. And he's obviously unsuccessful, and we have the massacre. But he, as I said, he plays a very prominent role in that, as kind of a voice of reason in the whole thing, and ends up um, testifying as a witness at the trial of the soldiers. And he actually testifies in favor of Captain Preston, the British commander at the massacre. He basically says Preston was trying to hold back the men. He never gave an order to fire, all that sort of thing. So he gains a little bit of prominence right there at the Boston Massacre.
Right. And that, as you said, he's just, what, 20 years old at that point and has yet to
Yeah,
even.
he's 19. Yeah,
19. Okay, yeah. He's yet to open his bookstore. You said it was the following year in 71, if I'm not mistaken.
that's right. And in 71, he opens his bookstore. Um, he joins the local militia. He actually joins the artillery company in Boston, and manages to shoot off several fingers on his hand about the same time. He was going hunting with his younger brother and had a shotgun and managed to blow off several of his own fingers when he was mishandling the gun. Ironically, it's about this same time that he's almost made himself into a cripple that he attracts the attention of a daughter of a fairly wealthy family, the Flucker family, and Lucy Flucker begins to take an interest in him. So, which at this age, I think she's 15 years old. So, and he's 20, or 21 by this time, maybe. So there's a bit of an age gap there, pretty considerable. Probably be scandalous today.
It would have been
But
scandalous back then. Also, despite what people commonly believe, young women did not marry generally in their mid teens.
Well, if they did, they usually married a very impressive gentleman with great wealth and stature.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a little young even for those times. And she, to be fair, she didn't get married at age 14. They were kind of just showing an interest in each other. The big problem was that her family was a very prominent Tory family. Her father had a position in the colonial government. He was actually the one who had to deliver This is a couple years later, had to deliver General Gage's orders to shut down the assembly. And, Sam Adams famously locked the doors, and he was banging on the door trying to tell them that they had to shut down. And Hamilton was trying to finish business. Like, I think this was when they were sending people to the First Continental Congress.
Right.
So yeah, the father was a Tory. He was a loyalist. He was a friend to the king, and he did not like the idea of his daughter hanging out with this guy who was a member of the Sons of Liberty. Um, on top of that, of course, he was also a tradesman, and um, he expected his daughter to be marrying a man of wealth and stature. And he actually warned her. He said, if you marry this guy, you're going to be jealous your whole life because you're going to see your sisters riding around in coaches and wearing nice dresses and going to balls, and you're going to be, working side by side with this guy in some trade, slaving your life away pushing out babies. So he really, really tried to dissuade her from pursuing this relationship, but she persisted, and eventually he did say, okay, if you really feel this way, um, you can get married. And they did get married in 1774. So after about 2 years of knowing each other, she was 17 when she got married. He was 24. So yeah. Um, but the Fluckers tried to bring him into the family. The father actually tried to get Henry a commission in the British Army as a regular, something that Henry politely declined. And yeah, so that was kind of where things stood on the brink of war.
Right. And then there's a war. Um,
Well, before we get to the actual war, we've got the Boston Tea Party,
oh, of
which
course, I'm always skipping things. I'm so
Henry. There's always lots of stuff happening in Boston before we get to the actual
I
war.
know, I know.
Um,
I didn't realize he played I'm not actually familiar with the role he played in the Boston Tea Party.
Well, we don't know exactly what role he played because the Boston Tea Party, which was not called a Tea Party until decades later, was considered a criminal act. And even after the war, people did not want to admit to being a part of it because they still might have been sued by the um,
The investors
tea,
and the owners of the
the
ship.
tea company. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to avoid suit, nobody really wanted to admit to being a part of it. But we do know that um, his militia did several times stand guard over the ships prior to the actual destruction of the tea. They had to kind of watch it day and night to make sure nobody tried to secretly offload the tea. Um, so he was part of that thing, and most people suspect that he did play some role in the Tea Party itself. He fit the profile of someone who would. He was obviously a committed patriot. He was not like most of the really high profile people, like Sam Adams or Joseph Warren. All went out and got alibis that night because they knew that their heads were going to be on a pike if they could be associated with it.
Right.
Um, Knox did not have that high profile position within Boston society or anything else. So he was probably one of the working class schmucks who actually boarded the ships and threw the tea overboard. But
Right.
as I said, we don't know that for certain because there are no good records.
Right. And we skipped ahead. This is a little bit before he gets married to or we jump back a little bit. It's even before he marries the Flucker family.
Oh no, he's married by this time.
Oh,
Oh no, no, I guess you're right. No, you're right. That
because
was
they
December 73 and
right
he got married in 74.
a few months later.
So yeah.
So
But
he doesn't even
the,
have
the
that
that
connection to his profile. Like you were saying with his high profile or
yeah.
low profile.
But the consequences of the Tea Party, of course, was the closure of the port of Boston, which happened like right after he got married. So Mr. Flucker has just handed off his daughter's hand to this guy who's running a bookstore, which he thinks is pretty low already. And now his bookstore is about to go under because of the Boston Port Act, means he's losing all of his trade and is not unable to buy new books, and obviously doesn't have customers with money to buy books. So he's about to have an unemployed bookseller as a son-in-law.
Right.
Which,
Exactly. Although,
not good either.
we should probably note that when the Stamp Act comes around, few people are more adversely affected than a book salesman with all that paper he's distributing in his books.
Well, books were actually exempt from the Stamp Act.
Were they?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
pamphlet pamphlets and smaller documents like almanacs and stuff were taxed, but if you had a hardcover book, it was not taxed.
Really?
Just
Well, look at
one of
that.
those
Learn something
silly
every
little
day.
things. Yeah,
Because I was under the impression that he would be extremely effective.
well,
I guess not very much.
booksellers did actually sell a lot of pamphlets and newspapers and stuff too,
Of
so he
course,
would
yeah.
have been impacted. But yeah, books were exempt.
Really interesting. I didn't consider that. It's really weird that like dice and playing cards were, but not. I guess you don't want to ruin a book. Was the thinking?
I don't know what the thinking was in that, but I don't know.
All right. Well, we'll have to look it up for next time.
I know it's the case. I just don't know the reason why. But yeah,
Yeah, I'm surprised. I didn't know that, but I'm also not surprised that's the case because books were so cherished at the time. But anyway, they took a
yeah. I
much
mean, you
better
could
care of them
argue that
back then.
the rich folks in Parliament thought that books were an important thing and shouldn't be taxed because they like to buy books. I don't know.
Right, I guess. Either way, Henry Knox is radicalized. Things continue. He gets married. Boston shuts down. And that's when things kind of start. Well, I guess about a year later is when things get going. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, there's the British are really becoming aware that Henry Knox is a potential problem. And I should say his bookstore sold was a big focus of it was selling military books, and he had a lot of British officers who were occupying Boston at this time, who were customers of his. So he kind of got to know many of the British officers who were in town. But he also was not afraid to express his opinion to them about a lot of what was going on. So they kind of started to peg him as a dangerous, potentially dangerous person. And they asked one of his friends actually to spy on him because they wanted to know more about what he was up to. Unfortunately, for the British at least, the friend that they asked to spy on him was another worker in the neighborhood named Paul Revere. And of course, Paul Revere had his own political sympathies that went right along with Knox's, so it didn't go very far.
I'll let you know.
Um,
Definitely.
yeah,
Be right back.
but um, but yeah, when the British marched on Lexington and conquered, and war really broke out, Knox had to slip out of town, and he actually had to sneak onto a ship at night and row across to Charleston and escape. And he took Lucy with him when he escaped town, and they had to leave without saying goodbye to her family. And her family, as loyalists, evacuated Boston a few months later, and she never saw them again.
That's extremely sad because now she's essentially not a camp follower. That wouldn't be her position, but relying on a Henry Knox who's busy for about a
Yeah,
decade and a half.
he's busy and he has absolutely nothing. He has no business, he has no money, he has no nothing. Um, but yeah, so he actually goes out to join the New England Army that is in Cambridge and outside of Boston. But he does not take a position. He does not enlist, and he does not take an officer's commission. He serves as a gentleman volunteer. Um,
Much like Von
and
Steuben.
yeah, and he portrays or presents himself as an expert in artillery and engineering and building of fortifications. And
Which he's not.
uh, he's
He's
not
he's
really,
read
no.
about it.
He's read a lot of books on the
A lot
topic,
of
so he thought he was an expert.
a little
And
bit of militia training for a few years.
yeah, real little bit of militia training,
Yeah.
but he's really, you know, faking it till he makes it here. Um,
You know who doesn't know that? George Washington.
yeah. Well, so right, he actually he has some role at Bunker Hill, though. It's not exactly clear what he did. Some people say he did some of the initial organization of cannon before the battle. But he plays no role, and not the Continental Army, whatever the army's called at this point, the Provincial Army
Yeah,
of New
Army of
England,
Observation. I've heard it called like a dozen things.
whatever they are, they have their own commander of artillery at this time, and it ain't Henry Knox. It's Richard Gridley, who was actually a served in the artillery in the British Army for a time. But Gridley does a really horrible job at Bunker Hill, and I think he's forced to resign. Although several of like his son and his nephew or something, were also top officers in his regiment. They get court-martialed for cowardice and all sorts of stuff. So it's a real mess. And so Gridley is kind of gone, and there is no head of artillery after that. And of course, a few weeks after Bunker Hill, along comes General George Washington to say, "Hey, let's start a Continental Army." Um,
That's how it went. George Washington
and
showed up and said, "I got an idea.
hey, hey
Hey
guys, let's
guys,
start a
what do you think
Continental
about
Army.
this? Put me in charge."
So yeah, but he gets up there, and remember, Knox is still a civilian, but he has arranged some of the fortifications around Boston. He, takes credit for a lot of the stuff that has already been set up, and Washington views that and is impressed. And Knox dines with Washington on a regular basis. He's invited to sit at his table and talk to him about the situation and what's going on. So he becomes a trusted aide from the get go. And So, yeah, Washington, uh, after a few months, recommends. And there's debate during this whole time about what they should do with Knox, and they actually offer him a position as a lieutenant colonel, which he turns down because hey, he's 25 years old. He should be a full bird colonel by now.
Yeah, I read a bunch of books about this.
Yeah. So, um,
I should note, I had a conversation with Dr. Lindsay Travinsky a few months back,
mhm,
who wrote the book The Cabinet, and we spoke more specifically about, spoiler alert for later in this conversation, the Washington administration. And she
yeah.
pointed out that Henry Knox seems to have had a certain charm about him that even Washington had to admit to liking, where like he was one of the few people who could casually refer to Washington as George and things like that, where like everyone else had to be very proper, but it was for some reason okay for Knox to be like jolly and fun. So I want to point that out here because I'm sure it had something to do with his seemingly out of nowhere rise to the rank he finally, to the trust he garners from Washington in the matter of just a few months.
Well, he obviously made a very good impression, and Washington kind of had a habit of adopting young men to kind of be in his quote family of important officers. And yeah, Knox kind of fell into that right away. He obviously got along with Washington very well. He impressed Washington with talking up a good game and putting together the artillery fortifications. So, and Knox had other friends in high places. He was good friends from before the war with John Adams and John Hancock, and he knew Sam Adams. So it's not like he was without connections. And John Adams actually recommended him as a colonel as well. And if John Adams and George Washington agree on that, let's do it, right? Um, so this is a few months into Washington, like I guess it's November or December. He finally get of 75 that he finally gets his commission as a colonel, a full colonel in the Continental Army. And Washington says, "I want you to be my head of artillery." And of course, Knox says, "Great, sounds wonderful. Where's my artillery?" He's like, "Well, got something to tell you about that. Um, your commander of artillery, now go find some artillery."
Right.
And he sends Knox traveling around to a number of places, including New York City, where they have a bunch of cannons, which are under the command of our friend Alexander McDougall, who we talked about a few weeks ago.
Which were
McDougall doesn't want to give him.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but which were largely taken by Alexander Hamilton and his entourage, I think, if my timeline adds up.
Uh, Hamilton did handle some of that, yeah,
He
but
was part of the storming of the battery.
yeah,
Yeah. I
and
have to
they
throw
they
Hamilton
were
in when I can. People like Alexander Hamilton, so I have to note he was involved.
he is having a moment.
He really
Um,
is. That's why I
but
referenced
yeah,
the
so
battery. It's in the song from the play, so if you recognize that part of the play.
and Knox was actually aware of Hamilton before this time because Hamilton had written a pamphlet in, I believe, 75 that was very popular, and Knox actually sold that pamphlet in his bookstore. So they were aware of each other by this time. But anyway, he's dealing with Alexander McDougall in New York. McDougall does not want to give him any of the heavy cannon because he wants to use those to oppose a British naval landing at the city, which he thinks is going to happen at some point. So he really doesn't get a whole lot from there. He heads out to Albany, doesn't get a whole lot there, but of course they say, well, head up the river a bit, and we got Fort Ticonderoga with dozens of cannons. And of course, he goes there, collects dozens of cannons, which he then hauls back to Boston. And this is known with Knox's own term, the noble train of artillery. Um, and this is actually quite a feat because we're talking about some of these guns weigh upwards of 5,000 pounds, and he has to put together the men, the oxen, the sleds to drag all this stuff back to Boston. That's not an easy feat, especially because a lot of these people were unwilling to help, and so it takes a lot of cajoling and leadership for him to actually get it there. The weather does not cooperate. They buy sleds because we're in January now, December, January. So they want to use sleds to pull it across the snow, but there's apparently at some points there's not enough snow that they can use the sleds, and at some points there's too much snow that they're getting buried in it. Um, they have all sorts of problems when the Teamsters get to the New York Massachusetts state line. They say, "Yeah, this is as far as we go. Good luck to you,"
Yeah.
and kind of dump him off. And he has to get a whole new set of people to continue the train. So it's one pain, and all sorts of other problems. That one cannon actually breaks through the ice and sinks into the bottom of the lake near Albany, and they have to dive into the lake. Again, this is January with ice on top of the lake, and put ropes around it and pull it out. So he actually manages to rescue this heavy cannon and bring it along. And Knox is actually playing a bit of a showman at this time. He's stopping in small towns and showing off all these impressive guns and even firing it off for the locals and all this thing. So he's kind of building his own reputation as he's going along. But he does manage. It takes him a little longer than he hoped, but by mid-January, he finally gets all these cannons back to Boston.
But you know what? That's a great recruiting tool to stop in all
Oh
these
yeah,
towns, especially in New England where most of the fighting's taking place, and be like, look, we're doing it. Look what we're bringing to the party. Are you going to come along? It's
yeah.
really wise. It's a really smart move for a young man. And as you said, they make it to Boston. And that makes all the difference. It's one of those momentum changing moments in the American Revolution. Because it's those.
Absolutely. It takes them a few weeks, but they eventually get the cannons put up on Dorchester Heights, and they force the British evacuation. And at that point, there is no major British force in any of the 13 colonies.
That thanks
We
to
won,
Henry.
guys. Let's
Yeah,
celebrate.
we won! Nothing could go wrong.
Yeah.
But no, it is one of the major moments in the American Revolution, the evacuation of Boston. And that's, I'd say, 95% Henry Knox's doing. I don't want to take anything from, John Thomas and Rufus Putnam and the other guys who actually put him on the heights. They get 5%. But as you indicated, it is no small feat moving that many giant cannons by hand. And again, you said it's wintertime. You have to feed all those people and animals. You have to clothe them. It's really
No, it was a
amazing.
very impressive feat. I don't mean to undersell it.
Yeah,
Just
no,
getting it from
I'm just overselling it
Ticonderoga to
for you.
Boston.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it was an amazingly difficult feat, and he was very celebrated for it. Although he did not get a promotion to brigadier as a result, he was still a colonel. But
That's
again,
okay.
he's 25 years old and hasn't actually fought in a battle yet. So let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Exactly. Exactly. So the books told you how to roll cannons. Very impressive, young man. So he continues on to impress. The British get scared away. Hooray! And then everyone moves to New York City.
Yes, and Henry Knox goes with the army to New York. He takes his wife with him, Lucy. And I should note, when we're talking about him charming Washington and stuff, Lucy is right by his side at these dinners, and Washington loves a young, pretty woman. Her and Katie Green, Nathaniel Green's wife, were the two who really were, taking Washington's attention at this time.
Yeah.
Um,
That continues throughout his career, by the way.
yeah, and Lucy, as you said, is from a very good family. She knows how to mix with the upper class and how to charm gentlemen and that sort of thing. And
But she
so,
gave
yeah,
up her
she's very
family.
good for,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah,
I was going to say
yeah.
she.
No, I'm just saying. Go ahead.
Oh, she gave up her family for the cause too, which I'm sure Washington was very
Yep.
pleased.
Yeah. Um, but anyway, so yeah,
So New York.
he's on his way to New York. Oh, I also mentioned one other little minor side note. When he was on his way to Ticonderoga, he came across some British prisoners that were being moved south to be held as prisoners of war. And he ended up spending the night talking with a young lieutenant about literature for the entire night. And this is Lieutenant John Andre, who will come back later in his story.
Right.
But anyway, so anyway, now he's moving on to New York. And he sets up the artillery around Manhattan. Lucy is with him until almost the day that the British land, and he finally says, "Yeah, this is not a safe place to be, honey. You got to go," and sends her up to Connecticut. But he remains and with Washington um, through the Battle of Long Island. He was on Manhattan. Um, when the Americans finally decide to withdraw from Manhattan, Knox's artillery is covering their retreat, and Knox is playing such an important role in the American rearguard against the approaching British that he's actually almost captured at this point, and at one point has to jump in a rowboat and row across the Hudson River to avoid being captured. So he's doing some impressive work. Um, the overall American cause is not looking quite so impressive at this time. The British have the overwhelming numbers. They've taken New York without much of a struggle. They capture Fort Washington at this time. Knox actually loses much of his heavy artillery at Fort Washington, as well as a good chunk of his men. Um, but he continues to retreat across New Jersey with Washington and ends up in Pennsylvania right before Christmas 1776.
At which point, famously, he joins the crossing of the Delaware.
Yes, he's part of the famous crossing, and it's all the more famous in that getting cannons across the icy Delaware River was, again, no small feat. And they took, I think, 18 cannons with them to Trenton. And for a force of 2,400, that's a lot. Usually you maybe have one or two cannons for every 1,000 men. So having 18 cannons with 2,400 men is a lot. And getting them across the river was very difficult. And getting them through the night march was extremely difficult. But Knox manages to pull it off, and his cannons are really critical to the victory at Trenton.
Uh, Followed thereafter by Princeton.
Yeah, and before we even get to Princeton, word of his action at Trenton reaches Congress, and they immediately promote him to brigadier general. So he finally gets his generalship on. It's well, he gets Congress votes on December 26th, the same day as Trenton, and he hears about it, I think, the day before Princeton. So
Oh, it's the same day as Trenton. So they were already in the motions of giving him the promotion by the time he's
yeah,
there.
they must have been,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, he's a very impressive man. If you ask him, it certainly seems like he would tell you. Right. So he is now a brigadier general. He's officially made the cut of generals. that we're looking for. Not well, not yet. Not the major general for this series of discussions, but he's up there as general. So continues, goes through Princeton and Trenton, uh, and then he pretty much sticks with Washington. If I'm not mistaken, he spends most of the war with Washington.
Yeah, I think that's true. He
He's
does go off on a couple of independent missions, but he's generally, yeah, he's not deployed with any other of the main leaders of the war.
artillery stays with the army, kind
Yeah,
of generally speaking. Uh, so he does participate, and again, if there's any stories along the way, I'm elapsing here. But he does participate in the Pennsylvania campaign as opposed to
yeah.
Saratoga.
The big threat to Knox at that point did not come from the British. It came from the French. General Ducaudray, as we all recall, had showed up with a piece of paper from Silas Deane in Paris saying, "Hey, I get to be commander of artillery. Where's my artillery, please?" Um, and Congress was about to give it to him, and Knox essentially said, "Okay, you want him to be head of artillery? Here's my letter of resignation. Sorry, guys, I'm out of here."
No,
And he was good friends with Generals Greene and Sullivan, and they also said, "Yeah, okay, you're going to put Frenchies in charge. Good luck. We're out of here."
right,
So several of them offered their resignations. Um, Eventually, Congress backed down, and they gave DeCaldre a more of an advisory position as to kind of serve as like an inspector general of the artillery, sort of, and basically somebody who would advise the commander, Knox, on how to do artillery.
right,
It was going to be a very awkward situation, and of course, DeCaldre resolved all that by conveniently drowning on his way to the Battle of
right,
Brandywine.
right away, right away.
So,
He's there like
yeah,
less than 4 weeks. Um,
yeah,
I shouldn't laugh at that. It's very sad. He did
it,
come to help.
it is sad, but it's ironic as well. I
It's
mean,
not. Yeah, I mean,
um,
his horse drowned him. So, but we spoke about that in previous weeks. Let's continue.
right,
Uh,
right.
so Knox does face a threat, but there is that unanimity, if you will, with him and the other generals. We already mentioned Greene and his spouse being friendly with Washington. Greene, as well as Sullivan, they play major roles in certain campaigns later in the war. So
Oh, yeah.
them standing together with Knox like that is extremely important.
Yeah, it helps Knox at the time, but also all three of them kind of get in hot water with Congress as a result, because Congress takes great offense at the fact that they're trying to tell Congress who they should or shouldn't promote, and that's seen as a military usurpation of civilian authority. So they're all kind of in the doghouse for a while as a result.
Oh well,
Um, but yeah, so it doesn't matter. They're still going to be in the army, and they go on to fight the Philadelphia campaign
yeah,
next.
they all come out of it. So he does fight through the Philadelphia campaign. I don't know if there's any um, specific actions or happenings that you would like to reference during that.
I mean, he's not particularly impressive. I mean, he doesn't do anything bad at Brandywine. Washington deploys him on Brandywine Creek to have an artillery duel with the Hessians. As you may know, at Brandywine, General Howe sent up the Hessians to kind of occupy the attention of the Americans while he took his regulars around their right flank and attacked them from the flank. So Knox is fighting this duel with the people who are meant to occupy his attention, but he does manage to escape and retreat with the army. His um, performance at Germantown is probably a little less impressive. Knox is the officer who's generally credited or blamed with the um, um, giving Washington the advice that he cannot let the British maintain the stone house that they had occupied on the battlefield at Cliveden. And so the American assault at Germantown kind of halts as they try to take this house for several hours. And that's largely blamed for the Americans losing the battle because they'd wasted so much time trying to take out these few dozen British troops in a stone house that the British have time to um, gather together their forces and mount a counterattack.
Right? Is
So,
that the Chew House?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, Benjamin Chew, who was a justice from Pennsylvania had owned the house, but he was a Tory who was long gone by this time.
Right, but had been, don't want to get off track, but a long time, we'll call him associate of Benjamin Franklin and a really important leader of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania until he left.
Yeah, and his daughter dated John Andre.
That's right. There it is. That's the founder of the day fun facts we like over here.
There you go.
So he does get that blame fairly or unfairly. It seems pretty fair. Not the best decision. And from there, as I said, he sticks with Washington really for the next several years. I don't know of him participating in any other major engagements. He's in Monmouth. Did we speak about that yet?
He does. Yeah, he's at Valley Forge for most of the winter, although he does spend a few months up in New England trying to find more cannons and recruits and stuff. So he is away from the army for a while, but he does get back in time to participate. Excuse me, at Monmouth. Um, Again, nothing particularly super impressive there, but he is there backing up Washington and supporting him.
Right. And then now I'm definitely skipping a lot here. We're skipping several years here. If there's anything I'm skipping, let me know.
Yeah, the Northern Army does not do a whole lot after Monmouth. I mean, obviously, Washington sent several Southern armies south. Knox is not with them. He's basically hanging out with Washington in northern New Jersey and southern New York, kind of just watching the British over in New York City. And so, yeah, there's not a whole lot going on for several
For
years.
several years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Until they make the decision to head to Yorktown, which goes pretty swimmingly.
The one interesting thing I guess he does do, it's not combat related, before Yorktown is that he uh, is at West Point and serves on the court martial of our favorite British officer, Major John Andre at this time, and sentences old acquaintance to death. So he is a part of all that. And after that, I think he actually gets command of West Point for a short time.
Does he?
Um, but yeah, then he follows Washington down to Yorktown.
He needs to be where the action is. And he joins him at Yorktown and witnesses victory.
Yeah, he's by Washington's side the whole time. His artillery plays an important role in the capture of the British Army there. And he's actually given um, a lot of credit for his work there, and that is in fact probably what inspires Congress several months later to finally give him his promotion to Major General.
Right. Well, only
And
only like a month or two later. He's the first person after Yorktown to be promoted
well,
to.
Yorktown was in October of '81. He
Right.
gets his promotion in March of '82, so it's about 4 months later.
Oh, I thought it was before that. I thought it was significantly before that. I don't have my list pulled up, so I'll have to take your word for it. I thought it was in the few days after, but I'm obviously mistaken. But either way, as a reward for what 8 or at that point 7 years of warfare, he is finally made a major general, makes it onto our
And, he,
list.
and to be fair, he is only 31 years old by this time, so it's still pretty impressive.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. As opposed to most of the people we've discussed today, he still has a fairly long career ahead of him after the war ends. Because George Washington resigns in 1783 as commander in chief, but they still have a little bit of army here. And Henry Knox, is made the first senior officer of the United States Army. He takes over for George as commander.
That's right. When Washington resigns at the end of 1783, after the British evacuate New York and the war is over, Knox is, I think, the only general in the Army who does not resign his commission and actually remains to command the Army. Now, the Army shrinks to almost nothing. I think at one point the Continental Army consists of 100 soldiers in the entire Army. So there's not a lot to command. A lot of what Knox is doing at this time, obviously, is not ordering around soldiers. It's um, dealing with military issues related to Indian tribes and how the militia are going to deal with hostile Indians. And he's working closely with Congress, who he's developed a better relationship with at this point. And after a couple of years, he actually replaces Benjamin Lincoln as the Secretary of War under the Articles of Confederation,
Right.
working for directly with the Congress.
Yeah, it's about a year and a half because he sticks around as commander of this small army for
Yeah,
what, like 6 months or 7 months, and then he takes some time off for the following year. Was it 1785? I think he is made. He's given. I see it. I've seen it called Secretary at War. I've seen it called Minister of War. Essentially, he's Secretary of War before that was a position under the Confederation Congress.
that's right. Yeah, I'm not sure the exact title either, but yeah, he's basically, running the War Department for Congress.
Right.
So it's kind of a bureaucratic position, but it's obviously somebody you want somebody with a lot of experience and military knowledge, which by this time he has.
Right. Now he really has it. And it's
Yeah,
also a federal position in a fashion. More in the federal, more like we would see the federal government after the Constitution's ratified than you see really anyone. You have John Jay running the foreign affairs, and you have, the
yeah. The
judges.
Continental Congress still, under the Articles of Confederation, still does not really have an executive branch. They basically just have the Congress. And what they had initially tried to do was run everything through committees, and they would have, John Adams headed the War Committee at one point, so he's kind of considered the first Secretary of War. At some point, the legislators realized that they weren't really good executives, and they started creating these kind of semi-executive positions within the Congress, and Secretary of War was one of them. And he wasn't the first person to hold. Actually, Horatio Gates kind of got the first position as head of the Board of War, which didn't go particularly well. But that's kind of how this position evolved. Is that they decided they really did need a professional, a soldier who knew what he was doing to kind of run the War Department, and that's what Henry Knox was doing.
Yeah. And he does that pretty well, I guess, because he's there for 5 years until the Constitution's ratified. And then good old George Wash comes back in the picture, takes over as president, basically just keeps Henry Knox where he is.
Right. Henry Knox becomes the first Secretary of War under the Constitution, which, yeah, I mean, a little bit different role, but yeah, essentially he's still kind of running the army. And I know a lot of times when we've talked about these generals, we talk about them joining the Society of Cincinnati once the war ends. Henry Knox is actually the guy who starts the Society of Cincinnati. He's really the founder of it and the generator of the society, although he hands the presidency to George Washington, obviously. But he really is kind of the father of the Society of Cincinnati.
Yeah. Well, he's one of these many officers who had lost everything.
Yeah.
So at the very least, we could have a hereditary organization that's definitely not nobility, where us military men can stick together. Uh, I, I love to emphasize too, though, is basically George Washington leaves the Continental Army, and Henry Knox takes over and is in charge of the military until George Washington comes back. That 5 year period, he is the American Army, which is, we talk about his artillery experience and his wagon train and all that good stuff, but that 5 year period is often overlooked. As you said, there's not a whole lot going on. It's mostly negotiating with Native Americans, but this is during the time where the Northwest Indian War starts to break out.
Yes.
Not that the hostilities are so extreme at that point, but that's when it's happening.
Right. And the Secretary of War, he is responsible for a lot of logistics in dealing with these things. So he's doing a reasonably good job with all of this.
Right. Then, as we said, Washington comes. He becomes Secretary of State. I mean, Secretary of War. During this time, he focuses on winning the Northwest Indian War primarily, which doesn't go great at first. We have some problems with the first gentleman, Hallam. No, first Harmar, I think is the name of the first guy who takes over and has a defeat before St. Clair comes in and has an even worse defeat. They and Henry Knox takes some of the blame for those defeats, at least from the people the defeats are named after.
Yeah.
As Secretary of War, you should have done a better job secretarying this war. Uh,
Well, yeah, all the generals always say, I didn't get enough arms, I didn't get enough supplies, I didn't get enough backup, I didn't get enough support, but you know, that
and they
comes with the
didn't,
territory.
but
No,
we couldn't let the new government look bad, so the blame was cast over on poor St. Clair. Although, to be fair, he was defeated. So, but Knox sticks around for a while. He makes it to Washington's second term. He leaves though right at the end of 1794. Right, so about the time
yeah,
Hamilton's leaving, he also leaves.
yeah. I mean, he's around for most of Washington's administration. Um, he's basically responsible for the Militia Act of 1792, which is what they were really using for an army by this time. The Continental, or not the Continental Army, the U.S. Army now had grown to, I don't know, 500 or 600 soldiers by this time. Um, but they really needed to have a larger force in place in case something bigger happened. And the Militia Act was designed to give the federal government the ability to call out the militia of the several states when needed, that sort of thing. And of course, it was used during the um, Whiskey Rebellion,
Right.
when they called up a militia army to go suppress the rebellion, and Knox was a part of that as well.
That's right. He did help suppress those uh, former patriot. I don't know. I don't know how to say it. I have a lot of sympathy for the risky rebels, to be honest with you. If I will let my objectivity be transparent for a second, um, but he did. He did suppress them. He did. He was Secretary of War during that particular incident. That being said, as we were saying, he does eventually resign, which I understand breaks Washington's heart to a pretty large degree. He was not happy to lose Jefferson and Hamilton over the years, but uh, as we mentioned earlier, he immediately took to Henry Knox and was
Well,
very.
Henry Knox, as you said, had been by his side for the entire war. He was somebody that he could rely on very much. So, I mean, Hamilton had been his aide for a time, but Hamilton also had a break with Washington during the war and went off to have an independent command. Henry Knox stayed by his side during the entire war. And Washington was not crazy about having a first term as president, let alone a second term. And kind of his whole cabinet, including Knox, talked him into it, saying the country really needs you to do this. And then as soon as he's like into his second term, all the cabinet members like, yeah, now we're out of here. We're sick of this
Yeah,
crap.
I don't,
Good luck on your own, George.
yeah, we said they needed you. And that's what happens. But and I understand that of all those people, arguably Knox's leaving kind of hurt Washington the most. Not just because I mean we've covered 20 years over the course of this conversation from 75
Yeah,
till 94. That's 20 years of being pretty much always at their side, except that 5 year period where Washington went home and Knox took over. Um,
yeah,
and again, as we mentioned earlier, they had that certain Knox had that certain charisma, that charm, where he's as I mentioned earlier, he spoke to Washington in a more casual a more casual way than almost anyone else. So to lose that friendship, I understand was very challenging for Washington. But Knox
I
was
don't
over it.
know.
I don't know.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, they obviously Knox headed north again, and they just didn't weren't in much communication after that.
There wasn't a ton. Reflecting again on the conversation I had with Dr. Travinsky, she had mentioned that he goes north, and Washington kind of sends him letters like, "Are you sure you don't want to?" Like kind of heartbroken letters, like saying, "Are you sure you don't want to come back?" And Knox is like, "No, dude, I'm not a kid anymore. I need a break. Thanks, friend." Um, So
Yeah,
he,
yeah, he was really kind of broke, and he was actually had a lot of land coming to him for his service in the army, and he settled a pretty fairly large estate in what became Maine, which I guess at that point was still part of Massachusetts, but up kind of in the Maine wilderness, started his own fairly large plantation.
yeah, yeah, that's the next step. He leaves and he kind of semi-retires to be a fair businessman, I guess you could say. Settles a whole bunch of land as a cattle farm that's pretty successful. He dips his toes in a lot of things: shipbuilding, uh, uh, lumber, uh, things that are eluding me right now. uh, oh, and he was also a landlord. He starts selling off or renting out giant portions of his land to be settled.
Yeah, I think kind of hurt his reputation too. He tended to be a bit of a dick landlord, and got
Yeah.
into some problems there as well. But
Well,
hey,
my understanding is he was a pretty strict landlord and would regularly have people kicked off the property if they weren't paying. He does go on to serve in the Massachusetts General Court for a little bit, which, as you mentioned, Maine was still at this point part of Massachusetts, so elected representative in Maine would go to Massachusetts to serve, and he serves briefly for like maybe a year, but then he's so wildly unpopular with the people who live around him in Maine that he loses his first, like, as an incumbent election. He loses to some blacksmith. Now, I have not been able to track down who this blacksmith is because I would love to make him founder of the day. But a local, as we mentioned earlier, an artisan generally didn't get elected to these positions, but
yeah,
dictator Knox over here was so unpopular that he is sent
yeah, come on, the
right
guy's a
back home.
war hero. He's a war hero, and they're still tossing him out. He's got to feel
Yeah,
something. But
yeah,
to be fair, I mean, Knox, you know, yes, he was pretty harsh with his tenants, but he actually had a lot of debt too that he was trying. He had 20, as you say, 20 years of military and government service had left him with a lot of debt that he needed to deal with, and that's a lot of what he was trying to do with this.
right. Right, which makes sense. As we said, he started all these businesses. He was contributing to the community. I don't want to just hate on him now after we were so happy with him for most of this conversation. But, he moves to a part of Maine where they didn't like him hanging around. Uh, I understand. Actually, I did read this that one of the tenants that he kicks off his property is Joseph Plum Martin, who
Yes, that's right. That's
yes,
right.
later writes one of the more famous memoirs for anyone listening, of a soldier of the Revolution. I forget the title, eludes me right now, but Joseph Plum Martin is very famous, and he was not a fan of Henry Knox.
No, not at all. But Knox actually ends up having to sell most of his lands to repay his debt.
Right.
So he's not like this big rich guy who just lives well for the rest of his life.
Right.
Um, an even richer guy, William Bingham, ends up buying most of his property in Maine. Bingham is famous for being the namesake of Binghamton, New York, obviously.
I think of him every time I travel home because I was like an hour north of Binghamton. So every time I travel, I'm like, oh yeah, William Binghamton. Never actually came to Binghamton, uh,
No,
but
just bought it.
bought a lot of land. And
Yeah.
again, that's all. We could get way off track here. William Bingham is a fascinating part of the American Revolution. Look him up. I'm sure.
Hmm.
I know Michael's done a great episode on him. I'm sure I talked about him at one point or another too.
Yeah, he operated as an agent in the Caribbean during the war.
Yeah,
He had a pretty interesting life.
yeah. He was like Ben Frank, the middleman for corresponding and things like that. Yeah, your episode. I listened to it a very long time ago, but I remember it, which means it was probably great. Yeah, and I don't know if there's anything else on Henry Knox you wanted to bring up, uh, unless you wanted to bring up his death, which is fascinating.
Yeah, sadly, he could have, being born in 1750, could have lived well into the Jacksonian era. Unfortunately, in 1806, he got into a tussle with a chicken, and died choking on a chicken bone at the age of 56 in 1806. So, yeah, he died only a few years after Washington, despite the fact that he was a generation younger.
Yeah. Yeah, 56. Yeah, you're right. I didn't even consider that part of it. But yeah, unfortunately, uh, I'm not comfortable saying it again. He suffocated on a chicken bone because, anyway.
Yeah, he somehow choked on a chicken bone. I don't know what he was doing, but yeah. Um,
I don't think we're supposed to
uh,
say that on camera. Never mind. Anyway, for the grown-ups in the audience, uh, he had a very unceremonious demise, and that's pretty much it. Is there anything else we should add about General Knox?
no, I don't think so. I mean, his wife lived another 20 years, but again, she was had money troubles for the rest of her life. He did have a bunch of kids, but only one of them actually survived to adulthood, and he ended up kind of getting a reputation as a drunkard and engaging in quote scandalous behavior, whatever that means.
Right.
So yeah, not much of a legacy there. Um, but yeah, that was kind of the end of Henry Knox.
All right. Well, there it is. Founder fans. That's a thorough investigation of the career of Henry Knox. Michael Troy, thank you so much for coming back.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And we'll be back next week with our last two American founders.